papers, and baking a cake. With the first class of actions, one performs them without performing first some other actions. On the other hand, with the second class of actions, one performs them by first performing some other actions. Joel Feinberg calls the former class of actions simple acts, while the latter class complex acts. Simple acts are bodily movements that do not require doing something else to perform. In raising our arm, for instance, we just do it. On the other hand, complex acts require bodily movements as means for us to perform them. If I want to brush my teeth, I need to do some other actions, such as open my mouth, hold a toothbrush, put some toothpaste on the brush of the toothbrush, and then move my hand up and down with the brush of the toothbrush touching my teeth. The possibility of complex actions is made possible by the flexibility of language. Instead of saying that we do X, Y, and Z in order to do W, we just say we do W. This feature of language has been baptized by Feinberg as the accordion effect, because an act like the folding musical instrument can be squeezed down to a minimum or else stretched out. With simple acts, it is relatively not difficult to attribute accountability. But with complex acts, because they involve a class of actions that often forms a series, to attribute accountability to the agent of complex acts, we must also analyze the class of actions involved in the complex acts. So we have simple acts. These are acts that we just do without doing other actions. Like I want to raise my arm, but if I want to brush my teeth, that's a complex act, because before I can do it, I must perform some other actions. Now, this will raise a problem regarding accountability, especially with regard to complex acts. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to show you a puzzle that is called Chisholm puzzle, because Chisholm was the first who conceived of puzzles of this kind. So look at read the situation. Romeo shoots at Leo in order to kill Leo. Romeo misses Leo, but the shot stampedes a herd of wild pigs that tramples Leo to death. Is Romeo accountable for the death of Leo? We shall analyze for our purpose this one. But here is another interesting puzzle of this kind. Bill intends to kill James. While Bill is out driving to go to James' place, he thinks about his intention to kill James and how he will do it. This makes Bill so excited and nervous that he loses control of the steering wheel, and as a result, he accidentally runs over and kills a pedestrian. The pedestrian happens to be James. Is Bill accountable for the death of James? Okay. Ang hirap nito. In intending to perform a complex act, I necessarily must intend also the other actions necessary to perform the complex act. We may refer to these actions as the antecedent actions, and the complex act that they lead to as the consequent action. So if I want to shoot someone, my consequent action would be to shoot that person. But for me to do that, I must do some antecedent actions, like hold a gun, pull the trigger, aim the gun at this person, so on and so forth. Now, what happens in the case in question, Romeo killing Leo, is that Romeo intends a particular consequent act, namely the death of Leo. But his intended antecedent actions, namely to shoot at Leo's body, which presumably includes the actions of holding a loaded gun, aiming this gun at Leo and pulling the trigger, and for this shot to hit its intended target. What happens is one intended antecedent action causally leads to some unintended action or event that in turn causally leads to the intended consequent action. Romeo does shoot Leo, but his shot does not hit its intended target. What it hits instead is the nearby herd of wild pigs. The stampeding wild pigs trampling Leo to death is not an antecedent action that Romeo intends. The causal link that has transpired between Romeo shooting at Leo and the death of Leo is not what has been intended by Romeo. Next slide. Consequently, with regard to the death of Leo per se, we therefore cannot say that Romeo is accountable for it. For Romeo's intended causal series of antecedent actions is not what leads to it. However, Romeo, we can say, is still accountable for intending to kill Leo and for performing actions intended to carry out such an intention, such as holding a loaded gun, aiming it at Leo, and pulling its trigger. Romeo intended these antecedent actions, and since they are wrong, which presumably is capable of knowing, then he deserves blame for them. Romeo may not be accountable for the eventual death of Leo, but he is accountable for his actions that are intended to carry out his goal of killing Leo. In fact, Leo may have survived the stampeding herd of wild pigs, but this does not change the fact that Romeo performed actions intended to kill Leo, which are wrong, and thus Romeo deserved blame and punishment. In sum, one is accountable for a complex act if the incriminating conditions obtained for such act, and for every intended act in a causal series of antecedent actions intended to lead to the complex act. Okay, I'm tempted to give this another example. Supposing somebody wants to kill another person while sleeping, but he doesn't know that actually the person already died out of what we call nightmare or bangungot. Okay, so when he shoots this person, actually the person is already dead. So will he be accountable for the death of the person when this person is already dead? Binangungot na pala. Okay, so this is a situation of the same kind here. So what I'm trying to say here is that with regard to complex acts, we are responsible for this complex act if we are also responsible for the antecedent acts. Okay, but what happens in the case here is that one antecedent act leads to an unintended event that eventually leads to the consequent act. So the series of actions that lead to the consequent act is not what the person has intended. Okay. Let me move on to another issue here, actions and their descriptions. In referring to a particular action, we can use various descriptions. For instance, suppose I am presently performing an action that can be identified using the description, I am playing the guitar. This action of mine can also be identified using other descriptions, such as, I am presently practicing for my performance in tomorrow's program or activity. I am presently entertaining my wife. I am putting my daughter to sleep, and various others. So let's say I am performing an action which I can describe as I am playing the piano. I can also describe it as I am putting my daughter to sleep, or I am entertaining my wife. So such action can be described in various ways. Although of course we may be asked, what is it really that you are doing? Okay. Now a controversy arises here, namely, whether the various descriptions that allegedly identify one action really identify just one action, or they actually identify different actions. So, I am describing an action in various kinds. The question arises, is there really just one action, or are there many actions that are being done simultaneously? Like, I'm playing the guitar is one action, I am entertaining my wife is one action, and I am practicing for tomorrow's activity is another action. So this is an issue in the area called the metaphysics of action. Regardless of whether we are doing only one action or different actions, the critical question is whether such an action or actions conform to the incriminating conditions of accountability. Insofar as we are concerned, we are doing a particular action whose description is what we have in mind in performing such an act. If other persons describe our action in another way, as another type of action, the question is whether we intend to perform such an action that they have so described, and whether we are knowledgeable about the wrongfulness or rightfulness of such an action so described by them. Next slide, please. So let's say this classic example by Anscombe. Let's say I'm performing a certain action which can be described in various ways. In one sense, I can be said to be, I'm moving my arm up and down. And in another sense, I can be said to be doing as follows. I'm operating the water pump. I am replenishing the water supply of the community. I am poisoning the inhabitants. So, how does accountability apply here? Because it seems that in one description, let's say, I deserve blame, I deserve a reward. Let's say, presumably, I am replenishing the water supply of the community is a good act, so I should deserve praise for my action. But poisoning the inhabitants is a wrongful act, therefore I should deserve blame. So, should I deserve blame or praise for performing action X? So you may say it depends on how you describe my action. Or again, the answer is what description I intend my action to have. So if I describe my action as I'm replenishing the water supply of the community, then I deserve praise for it. But if I'm poisoning the inhabitants, then therefore I deserve blame for it. Okay. Let's move on to the last point here. Incontinent actions. A strange phenomenon closely related to our capacity to perform intentional actions is called weakness of the will, also called acrasia or incontinence. This phenomenon refers to our failure to act on our best judgment. The person who acts as a result of weakness of the will is often described by philosophers as an acratic person, and his action as an incontinent action. Conversely, acting on our best judgment is called strength of the will or continence, and the action that results from it as a continent action. To clearly illustrate the phenomenon of the weakness of the will, consider the following sets of propositions. So, I have here two premises. In the first one, I am free to do either X or Y. And I intend to do either X or Y. In the second premise, I judge that it would be better for me to do X than to do Y. Because of that judgment, I therefore desire to do X more than I desire to do Y. Now, if these two premises are there, what do you think is the likely conclusion? Which action will I do? X or Y? Now, if I do X, then I perform an action that is consistent with my better judgment. Because my better judgment is that X is better than Y. So I do Y, I do X. That's a continent action. That's an action manifesting strength of the will. But if I do Y, now that manifests weakness of the will, the incontinent action. Now, what do you think? Do incontinent actions exist? Meaning, are there cases where you think you are fully convinced that X is better than Y, and you desire to do X more than Y, but you find yourself doing Y later on? Okay. To illustrate, suppose tonight Maria is free either to study for her examinations tomorrow or to watch her favorite TV shows. After some deliberation, she concludes that it is better for her to study for her examinations than to watch her favorite TV shows. As a result, she then resolves to study for her examinations tonight and not to watch her favorite TV shows. Yet, when the appropriate time comes for Maria to put her intention into action, Maria ends up watching her favorite TV shows. Maria, we can say, fails to act on her intention that represents her own better judgment, or that she acts against her own better judgment. In this life, Maria has performed an incontinent action, or has manifested weakness of the will. Now, what is the problem here? Now, while it seems obvious in ordinary life that C2 here can happen given P1 and P2, some, however, doubt its possibility. Some think that only C1 can possibly follow from P1 and P2. In short, some philosophers argue that incontinent actions are not possible, while some dispute it. Next slide, please. So there is a debate whether weakness of the will is possible. Why? Because we have this theory of action attributed to Aristotle that goes this way. An action is intended to satisfy a desire, and a desire necessarily is directed towards some good. The idea is that you desire only that which you think is good. Desire is necessarily directed towards something you think is good. Hence, incontinent acts are impossible. So, if that is what desire is, that it's necessarily directed at some good, then what you do is always what you think is good. So if given a choice between X and Y, if you perform X, that means you think X is better than Y. So in light of this theory of action, incontinent actions are not possible. Now, Donald Davidson thinks otherwise. He thinks that even if we grant the Aristotelian theory of action, incontinent acts are still possible. By regarding P2, which in the previous slide states, it would be better to do X than to do Y, as a conditional evaluative judgment, or a judgment qualified by all things considered. So the debate is, let's say you think X is better than Y, and you desire X more than Y. Is it possible that in the end you will do Y? Some say that at the time that you do Y, you change your mind, that Y now is better than X. In that sense, it's not a case of weakness of the will. The case of the weakness of the will is that in performing Y, you still think that X is better than Y. But if you change your mind, and later on you think Y is better than X, that is not a case of weakness of the will. Now, Davidson claims that when you say X is better than Y, that is a conditional judgment. Meaning, all things being considered, you think X is better than Y. But later on, if some factors come in or get into the picture, let's say either you study for your exam tonight or you watch your favorite TV show and you think it's better for you to study tonight, but you end up watching your TV show because now a new information comes up. Let's say, yung new TV show mo, i-reveal na yung mga mysteries doon, na? Andyan na yung culminating story. Okay? So, they say, you now change your mind. That watching your favorite TV show is now better than studying for your exam. In any case, our, of course, concern here is how can we attribute accountability for incontinent acts. Now, as incontinent actions are intentional actions whose wrongfulness or rightfulness we can have knowledge of, incontinent actions are obviously actions that we can be accountable for. It is important to note, however, that when we say that it would be better to do X than to do Y, we do not necessarily mean here that X is morally right and Y is morally wrong. Next slide, please. Weakness of the will does not always involve moral weakness, wherein a person fails to act on what he or she believes to be the morally correct option. Yung weakness of the will is not exclusive to moral choices. Here is a good example by Davidson. I have just relaxed in bed after a hard day when it occurs to me that I have not brushed my teeth. Concern for my teeth beats me to rise and brush. Sensual indulgence suggests I forget my teeth for once. I weigh the alternatives in the light of the reasons. On the one hand, my teeth are strong, and at my age, decay is slow. It won't matter much if I don't brush them. On the other hand, if I get up, it will spoil my calm and may result in a bad night's sleep. Everything considered, I judge I will do better to stay in bed. Yet my feeling that I ought to brush my teeth is too strong for me. Warily, I leave my bed and brush my teeth. My act is clearly intentional, although against my better judgment, and so is incontinent. So what I'm saying is that weakness of the will does not necessarily mean moral weakness, because it may pertain to actions that may be non-moral. Okay. So we shouldn't equate weakness of the will as a kind of moral weakness. Another critical consideration here is that there is also no assumption that our judgment is correct. If we say that X is better than Y, we can be mistaken about it. As Davidson says, our judgment here depends on the available information that we have. It may happen that our information is incomplete, or some of them are wrong, and we made the wrong inference given the right information. Given that our judgment is morally neutral and not necessarily the correct one in cases of incontinent actions, we can identify the following possibilities. Okay, so given these two conditions, incontinent actions are morally neutral and our better judgment may be mistaken. These are the following possibilities. If my better judgment is right, meaning if I think that X is better than Y, and in fact I am correct in thinking so, I deserve praise for doing the continent action, while blamed for doing the incontinent one. If my better judgment is wrong, meaning I think that X is better than Y, when actually Y is better than X, I deserve blame for doing the continent action while praise for doing the incontinent one. Furthermore, if this judgment is a result of real ignorance, I am accountable for my action. If otherwise, I am not accountable for it. So just the same, we are applying the conditions of for the attribution of accountability to incontinent actions. In conclusion, I have tried to show how the conditions for the attribution of accountability work in the context of some philosophical issues arising from the relation among action, knowledge, and intention. In particular, our account of accountability took note of the varying conditions in which a person is knowledgeable or ignorant of what he ought to do, the varying circumstances in which a person is prevented from choosing to perform the right actions or is forced to make the wrong actions, and the varying natures of the types of actions that a person chooses to perform. I hope I have contributed to the clarification of the concept of accountability. But if I have instead generated further confusions, I am fully accountable for them. Thank you very much for listening.